Hi, and welcome to The Social Angle, a podcast that helps promo pros gain an edge in the social media realm. I'm digital content director Vinnie Driscoll, and on this episode, I'm joined by Matt LaWell, managing editor for Golf Course Industry Magazine at GIE Media Inc., to discuss how you can monetize your podcast. Matt, welcome to The Social Angle.
Vinnie, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. How are things out in Ohio today?
Beautiful weather, and did not unfortunately walk my kindergartner to school. She has a week left. She wanted to drive so she could play with friends a little bit more before school. Other than that, I prefer to walk rather than drive in the morning. Other than that, doing just fine.
Awesome. Yeah, things are really beautiful today out in Pennsylvania, not too far from you guys. It was hot last weekend, brutally hot. I don't know what it was like out your way, but I'll take the 70s over the 90s any day. But I do know that summer's coming, so I have to get used to that. So before we get started, can you take a minute to introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. So as you said in the intro, which good and to the point, and not long. I was hoping you didn't give me a over the top 2-minute intro. I have been at GIE and Golf Course Industry for a little more than 3 years. When I started, we had a magazine, monthly magazine, still have that. Had a website, still have that. Twitter, Facebook, no real TikTok or Instagram. We still have those, but we only had one podcast, one monthly podcast. I didn't handle it. So one of the things that I did about 3 or 4 months in was pitch all these various ideas. They all got picked up, and before I knew it, we were basically doing a podcast a week. So in terms of, and apologies, I thought I'd turned off Teams. There's
It's all good
throughout. Before I knew it, we were doing a podcast a week, in addition to the magazine and the website and the social and the travel and everything else. And as you know, you produce a podcast end to end. It does add a fair amount of work, but it's a different sort of work. And as a voracious podcast consumer, I probably average 10 to 11 a day of various lengths. It's just something that you have to do if you're in media. And I feel like most people enjoy it. If you're in media, if you're in the business of talking with people, it's literally just talking with people. So we cover that, all angles of golf course maintenance and sports field maintenance. So not championship golf, not competitive golf, but the folks who actually make the courses look great.
Cool. So I'm definitely talking to the right guy here. You're not only a producer of a podcast, but you're also a consumer. Which is why I reached out to you. You gave a session at the conference that we were both at a couple weeks ago, and I really wanted to reach out to you to touch upon this subject, because this is one that not only my industry but many industries are. Podcasts are booming. People are doing podcasts. So that's the $1 million question. So many people are doing them, but how do you monetize them? You said at the conference that anyone who has a podcast should be monetizing it. How can they do that?
So it took us a couple months to get in on everything. But the first step is, before anything else, really before even talking with sales, figure out what you want to do. So whether that's, if you're in media, whether that's traditional media or more so B2B niche industry publishing, anything where there's that super focused, hyper focused industry that you're covering, figure out what you're going to do. If it's recapping or taking a different angle for some of the stories and columns in your magazine, if it's an extension of a conversation featured in the magazine, which leads to all sorts of other cross promotional stuff with the transcripts and turning that into a one-pager in the magazine, or just a conversation with you and a coworker. Figure out what you're going to do, plot it out, come up with ideas. It's not too dissimilar if you have a columnist, where anybody can write a column. It's being able to write one week after week or month after month. You have to come up with a few ideas to get you off and running. Once you do that, then you need a great relationship with your sales department. Know what you're going to give them so they know what they're going to sell, to make it easier. And especially in industry publishing, especially in B2B or niche topics, you don't need that 50, 60, 70, 100,000 downloads to hit good advertising revenue. We routinely get into 4 figures for downloads in terms of numbers per episode. but it's not like we're Stuff You Should Know or The Daily or any of those big podcasts where you measure your downloads in six figures. You also aren't going to get super rich, but you can create enough revenue over time, I think, year over year to maybe handle your freelance budget, maybe to handle some travel, and eventually it will become a line item to not replace, but complement everything else that you're doing. You have to look at it as a part of the total package. It's not going to be the thing.
Right. So you're saying that when you set up a podcast, from the conception of it to the production, you should be thinking about how to monetize this, how to work in your sales department, and how, possibly it can be sold.
Right. And I was not good at that before I came to GIE. My editor, who is an old school newspaper guy, bought into it out of the gate completely. And whenever he comes up with a project, he thinks, can this be in print? Can this be on a podcast? Can we roll this into social media? We've been profitable as a magazine 11 straight years. And a lot of that is because of thinking of projects that can incorporate advertising. It's maybe branded content, it's maybe sponsored content. Most of the time, though, it's just a good story that we were going to tell anyway, that a company might be interested in putting their name on. Some of them, like I said, are sponsored content. That's part of it. That's part of the game these days. But if you have a good idea, do it anyway. And if you can get someone to give you money for it, fantastic.
Yeah. So, and I think you touched upon something important there. And I think a lot of people who create podcasts, the ones who are coming up with the ideas and formulating the stories, are not the ones who typically sell the podcast. And
Right.
I think that's where the roadblock comes into play. And I know even in the industry that I'm in, I see all these people who have podcasts who are not monetizing them. And I'm thinking they're of the same mindset as I am. I'm not thinking about monetizing. I'm just trying to think of great ways I could tell stories in this new medium. And I say new, in air quotes. It's been around for a while. But to me, I feel like that's where the roadblock is. You're not integrating the entire podcast into the whole company. Like the sales department should be involved. And I think that's an important and a major step in getting the monetization going, correct?
Absolutely. And our sales folks, I don't know that they listen to a lot of podcasts. They listen to enough to know the overall structure and how to sell them. If you have folks in your building or in your company who actually listen to podcasts and they're in sales, that's a huge plus.
Sure.
As long as they know what they're selling, as long as they know how to pitch it and kind of paint the picture for potential advertisers, potential clients, that's going to make your job as a writer, as a podcaster, as an editor, that much easier, I think.
Right. And I think you also mentioned that the podcast you do, is it weekly?
We actually have about 6 monthly series.
Okay.
Everything is essentially once a month, but 4 of them are ours, and then 2 we actually outsourced to freelancers who were doing it anyway. So we brought them into the fold, kind of the podcast network. So essentially 6 monthly podcasts, works out to 2 weeks a month have 1, 2 weeks a month have 2.
Okay. Now, how important is consistency in monetization?
Number one. First off, you can't have 1 month on the first Tuesday and then not do anything for 7 weeks and then cluster 3 in a week and a half. I mean,
right.
It's just like if you print a magazine and you're monthly, you come out every 4.5 weeks, right? If you're a podcast and you're monthly, you come out every 4.5 weeks. If you're a weekly, you come out the same day every week. If you can do the same time every week, 6 a.m. Tuesday morning or whatever, all the better. My editor, who I work with on a daily basis, is usually farther ahead on his podcasting than I am. And he will edit them on Mondays and he will post them at like 7:30 on Monday night. And I almost get mad. I say, Guy, we post these on Tuesday morning. Can you just schedule it for like 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning? No. So if you're early, fine. But I think the biggest thing, is, and there's another Teams message.
Hashtag new normal, right?
I know. I'm trying to get used to it. It's 2 years in, Vinny. But the sales is obviously very important, but being consistent, you're absolutely right to bring that up, is just give people the expectation of when it's going to come in. There are podcasts I know exactly when they're going to come in. Midnight on Tuesday, 6 a.m. on Wednesday, Thursday afternoon. I love Fresh Air. Fresh Air does Terry Gross has been my podcast spirit animal since before I knew what a podcast.
Sure.
Listened to podcasts in the car on the radio with my dad before podcasts were a thing. Love Terry Gross. Fresh Air comes out, I think sometime normally between 3 and 4 Eastern on Spotify. I download it. I listen to it on the way home, just like when I was a kid. So
yeah, and I think that's important to note because when I first started podcasting in 2018, and I mentioned this with you earlier before we started recording, that I put more emphasis on creating a more NPR podcast polished, got, so much editing. It took forever. So there was no consistency in podcasts. And then I realized, hey, if I'm going to do this once a week, I got to make sure that, I have content lined up in advance and that I'm getting it out, and I try to get them out on Tuesdays. So for the past 2.5 years, I've been very consistent. Tuesdays. Sometimes I don't hit the Tuesday because I'm at a conference or, I'm at a trade show. But for the most part, I will say that I'm getting probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45 episodes a year for the last couple of years. And the consistency is there. And I think that's important to note for others who do podcasts. And I think there is consistency. I think a lot of people realize that, hey, if I'm going to set up a podcast, at least they understand we're going to do it once a month. We're going to do it once a week, quarterly, whatever it is, just be consistent. And I think that's an important aspect to selling it.
And two, anytime we work with sponsors where there might be a guest or where there might be an ad read, we give them an outline, just like if they were advertising in the magazine or on the website. This is when we need materials by, this is when it's going to go live, et cetera, et cetera. If it is a sponsored series, and we do a few of those, and we have sponsored one-offs as well, where they provide a guest and it's a conversation, it's the same thing. We need the guest information by this point so we can reach out and schedule. We're going to record on this date. We'll send you the audio by this date. It'll post on this date. So it's all schedules. It's all consistency, like you said. Again, not too dissimilar from publishing a magazine.
Sure, right? Sure. Yeah. Which we're very familiar with. So, so I actually, because I don't have much experience in this area, if at all, any. So when I Googled monetizing your podcast, there seems to be so many ways you could do this. You could straight up ask for donations. Hey,
sure.
You could sell, you could offer branded merchandise, which is right up, my alley because this is the industry I'm in. But it seems like selling ads and sponsorships seem to be the most common way to monetize a pod. Can you explain how you go about doing this? And I think you touched upon that a little bit with the sales department. But like, are there online tools? Like wonder if you're an independent producer of your podcast.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, how can you go ahead and get sponsorships or for any ads?
Well, I think it really is just old school sales. It's picking up the phone. It's having those relationships and building on the relationships you have. I have a podcast idea outside of work, and I've been dabbling in that, but it has not launched, and I have no idea how I'm going to sell sponsorships for that because I'm not in sales. My folks upstairs are in sales, and they handle that. Maybe I'll turn to them and give them a cut of commission. But you raise a good point on the Patreon, the Kickstarter method as well, because I do listen to a lot of podcasts that do that. And there's a lot of traditional media that do that as well. The Believer, great literary magazine, back to McSweeney's, I think a week or two ago. And apparently they are hard up enough for money that they're basically going the Patreon model to production of a quarterly magazine. There's so many podcasts that do that. My 5-year-old listens to a podcast, what's it called? Storytime with Philip and Mommy.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
No,
I got a 5-year-old too. I'm gonna introduce.
They read
to
a
that.
storybook every day. Mostly the mommy, not Philip.
Right.
They offer the same thing. They'll I think for a set amount, they'll send a message or they'll read you a special book or anything like that. So in terms of selling traditional ads, I don't know if I'm the best person to talk
Right.
about that, just because I'm in that old school media setting that's kind of adapted to new school. If you're just podcast, I hate to say this because this isn't really that great of an answer, but either pick up the phone and build those relationships with clients, or find someone who does have those.
Yeah. So basically get
Yeah.
your sales department involved.
Right.
So I think that's important.
Yeah, I know Anchor is one of the big publishing platforms. We don't use that. They do, I know, incorporate ads and ad reads and ad blocks within that as well. Just not something that I'm very familiar with, unfortunately.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, and you talked about earlier downloads and listens, metrics, and I think that's another roadblock for a lot of people who do podcasts. You know, they get a couple hundred listens, and they think there's no way an advertiser is going to throw money at a podcast that doesn't get a lot of listens or downloads. Is that true? Is there a certain amount of listens and downloads that you should be aspiring to? Is there a sweet spot that, you know, somebody should be looking at, or does that matter at all?
In my experience, as long as you are hitting some modicum of consistency with numbers, whether that's, like you said, 200, 300, 500, 1,000, 2,000, especially in really hyper-focused industries, whether it's, you know, branded products, product placement, golf course maintenance, gardening, anything like that. As long as you're getting the right listeners, you know, 1,000 people who deal in product placement, branded products, all that sort of stuff. I hate the saying that, you know, we only have 1,000 listeners, but we have the right listeners. It's like Velvet Underground. They only sold 1,000 albums, but everybody who bought the album started a band. As long as you have the right listeners, that goes a lot farther than having, you know, 20,000 random people listening to your podcast, and you've got an ad for Bombas socks with the code Vinnie for 10% off at checkout or whatever.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And, you know, it's very similar to social media. You know, I'm in the social media game.
Mhm.
And I always say, like, hey, if you have 100,000 followers and none of them are interested in what you're posting, like, that's less effective than having 1,000 followers who are dedicated to what you're doing. So,
Right.
so it's really knowing who your audience is, it sounds like, and making sure that, you know, at least you maintain a certain amount of metrics. You can kind of prove that, hey, this
Right.
podcast gets 500 listens, you know, 750, 100, even if it's the right audience. You're saying that shouldn't matter in terms of trying to sell it.
Right. And you do need to be consistent in terms of showing those metrics as well. And that can be a challenge to get those set up from Apple Music and Spotify and Stitcher. And honestly, the most consistent and the easiest number is probably if you put an audio version or even just a Zoom conversation of the podcast on YouTube, and you can see it from there. That is one latest piece of advice I picked up. I was at a wedding not too long ago, found out one of the guests was in, I think it was sales operations or advertising operations with the New York Times. I said, well, I have to talk with this guy for 5 minutes. And I asked him, and two pieces of advice. It's easier to sell all the slots, all the ad slots for a podcast to a single sponsor rather than piecemeal it. Okay, we'll consider that. And the other one was put everything on YouTube, which seems very easy. I haven't done it yet. We need to. But it makes sense in terms of, and running contrary to literally what I just said about the right listeners. YouTube at least expands the audience, and it's another avenue to put all your ideas and your content and your products out there. So you can always get a wider audience. And maybe if you get 500 people to listen on YouTube, maybe 5 or 10 are the right people.
Right.
Well,
you bring up a really good point, because what's the number one website on the planet? Google. What's the number two?
Right.
YouTube.
Yep.
YouTube is the number 2 hit website on the planet, and we try to put all of our content into YouTube. Now,
You're ahead of us.
yeah, I mean, but here's the thing: we don't get a lot of hits on YouTube, 50, 100 potentially. But your point is that if a sponsor knows that they're going to have that real estate on YouTube, then that is also in. Doesn't matter how many listens there are or clicks. If they know that their ad is going to be also on YouTube, then that's something else that you can sell with the ad.
Right. And video podcasting is great. Maybe if there is this Zoom conversation of us put up on YouTube, maybe if this is sponsored by a random company, you've sold it for 3-4 episodes, it goes in the lower right. That's one thing. But even if it's just the title card, we have a horizontally a portrait style title card. There's always the sponsor on the card if there's a sponsor for that episode.
Sure.
YouTube, it's going to be up for 30, 40, 50 minutes.
Right. Yeah. Right. So you're talking about like a lower thirds or
exactly.
Yeah. And that's certainly something that people should be looking into as well, especially with the video, and we started moving towards the video type of podcast a couple of years ago when the pandemic hit, because we were doing all of our podcasts through Zoom and Teams, and we decided, hey, we can repurpose this content and put it into all the avenues, where there's video. We started live streaming them on Facebook and LinkedIn, and also doing it on YouTube. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there. Now, this is segues to the next question I have about the best distribution channels. Now, we talked about this a little bit at the conference, and it's hard to kind of really gauge an overall metric. But for you, where do you put your podcast, and where do you see the best impact in terms of listens and downloads?
So we had a group of about 8 of us within the company hop on a Teams meeting just yesterday to determine and discuss whether we should move platforms, if we need to be consistent, if we all need to be working within the same editing and distribution. And while we don't have a set answer at this point, we're looking at a few different things. We use an internal system within our CMS. And when we post it, as long as it's tagged correctly, it goes first to the site, and then within about 5 minutes, if not a little less, it's on every platform. It's been queued up. That is, unfortunately, again, I hate to say this for smaller companies or folks who are doing this independently, that is where an IT department does and help a little bit. One of our IT folks set it up so it goes automatically to Apple, to Spotify, to Stitcher, to, I don't know if it's SoundCloud, but conceivably any top podcast platform. Beyond that, I think I mentioned once Anchor. I had a few folks whose podcasts I listened to, they don't do them anymore, unfortunately, who used Anchor, and that handled pretty much everything in terms of distribution for them. Here, let's do a real quick timeout. Was there something else that I did not address in that answer?
No, and that kind of, that's a good segue to my next question. Now, are you able to get a good, or at least one number from your IT department on how many downloads, listens are coming in from that distribution? Right.
That actually is one huge benefit, and I don't even know if everybody within our company knows it exists, but there is a tool that allows you to look from set date to set date. We usually do from January 1st to current, or we go last 6 months or last 12 months, and you can look at the overall number per episode, or you can dive into each episode and look to see where the downloads and the listens are coming from. Still Apple Music, surprisingly.
Yeah.
Outpacing Spotify, which surprises me, because I think Spotify is the most used platform at this point.
Yeah, we get most of our hits through Apple as well. SoundCloud, we get some decent traffic, and we push, out through, our social media channels as well, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. So it's not easy to get that one number, but, it seems like it's going to be a manual process until we can kind of figure out how you can get one number from all the distribution channels that you're pushing your podcast. But until then, look, you look at one platform, you say, oh, I got 100 listens on SoundCloud, 250 listens on Apple, but you got, 50 over here on YouTube, 150, 200. I mean, it adds up,
Before
eventually.
you know it, you're 600, 700. Yeah.
Yeah. And then maybe 1,000. And then you get to the point where you can say to a sponsor, hey, I get 1,000 hits on this podcast. But it's kind of, it's fractured, but hey, if you have the metrics and all the social media and all these platforms can give you metrics, you can prove that your podcast is indeed getting what you're telling them. So I have a few more questions for you, Matt.
Sure.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But this is one that I know my company has been asking. This is something we did years ago because we had an online radio show. But when it comes to ads on a podcast, which ones are the least intrusive or most effective? You have the pre-roll. You talked about a little bit about having a static ad, like a lower thirds. You have mid-roll ads where people kind of, it's like a red advertisement mid, and then there's on-air ads read by talent or pre-recorded commercials. What do you think are the most effective and the ones that don't really kind of push away audiences? Because I know there are some off-putting ads.
There are so many different approaches. There are really long podcasts that start with 4, 5, 6-minute ad reads. The more classic 45 to 50-minute podcasts with one intro, 2 in the middle, 1 near the end, 1 on the out. But to your point on different types of ads, rather than where they go, there are baked in and they're dynamic. And baked in is where if in the middle of this podcast, you just said, and now we're going to take a real quick aside. We're going to talk about, and I'm looking in the back here. We're going to talk about the Avett Brothers. This podcast brought to you by the Avett Brothers, North Carolina's favorite folk rock band. And you talk about the Avett Brothers for 3 minutes because they gave you $5,000 or whatever. Whereas a dynamic ad would be if you pre-recorded that, put in a slot, and maybe had a clean break. Baked in, it's just part of the conversation. Dynamic, you drop it in. Now, I know at the conference, I addressed this because it had been in an email 2 days before. Great podcast newsletter. Cannot recommend it enough. Hot Pod used to be run by Nick Qua, who's now covering podcasts for Vulture. And I cannot remember who writes it now, but Hot Pod, HOTPOD, covers a lot of the ins and outs in the business dealings in podcasts. Referenced a study that podcast revenue projected by 2024 to be $4 billion. Now, 3 years ago, podcast revenue was projected by 2022 to be $1.6 billion. That was obviously before the pandemic. I'm sure that changed listening habits a little bit. That increased it, that helped it. But the single biggest factor in podcast revenue, annual podcast revenue going from 1.6 billion to 4 billion in projections in 2 years is dynamic ads, because you're able to slide ads in more easily. You're also able to change ads from A/B, so testing ads on different audiences if you're that advanced, if you're that sophisticated in what software, what program you're using. It also allows you to replace ads in the back catalog. And this is something that a lot of the bigger podcasts, Stuff You Should Know, does this a lot, where they'll re-record or they'll re-record new dynamic ads and then plug them into the back catalog. And they might sell them for 3 months, 6 months, a year. So then you're basically selling new ads on your back catalog. You're not doing any additional.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So these are some of the ways that advertisers and podcasters are getting a little more creative in terms of creating revenue. But the big difference, dynamic, baked in is much less intrusive. I'm personally much more likely to listen to a baked in ad read.
Sure.
I'm very good at skipping dynamic ad reads. I should probably listen to a few more, but the dynamic ads are what are really, really propelling money in this industry and putting money into the pockets and the checking accounts and the savings accounts.
Interesting. Now, are the dynamic ads being recorded by the advertiser?
A lot of times they're still read by the podcaster.
Okay, gotcha.
If you listen to the Daily most days, that's a lot more traditional media where it's a very clear ad. It's not read by Michael Barbaro or Sabrina Tabernese or whoever is hosting the episode. Whereas if you go, and I apologize for bringing up the same few podcasts, but they're just top of mind. Whereas if you do listen to Stuff You Should Know, Josh and Chuck, they're going to read a lot of those ads, not all of them, but they'll read some of them. So it sounds, at least at first, like a little bit of the show. You realize very quickly it's not. You either commit and you listen if you're driving or running, or if you're just sitting at your desk, you probably press the 15-second skip button 3 times. But yeah, a lot of times they are read by the podcaster. And I know this came up at the conference. Is there a moral issue? Is there an editorial issue with this? I think you have to weigh that person by person, individual by individual. I don't have an issue with it just because I'm already writing sponsored content. And I know that it doesn't really compromise what I do. So I don't mind reading an ad for a plant protecting company or an equipment company, but maybe somebody else does. That's something that needs to be addressed internally one by one, I think.
Yeah, so that's an editorial decision. But yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, I think about the baked in ads. I think I'm more apt to listen to those than you know, the more polished recorded ones that have you know, music in the background. It seems to take away from the show, whereas the baked in is like, it's just part of the conversation. They need to fill 45 seconds, 60 seconds, you know, give the advertiser their due, and it just kind of flows naturally into the conversation. But it feels like when a dynamic ad comes in, you could be there for 3-4 minutes. You don't know, you kind of check out. And I think that's where a lot of the, you know, the listens go down right when those dynamic ads come in. But if they're the ones making money, then, you know, they're worth selling. So Matt, again, this has been a great conversation. You know, you really touched upon some of the things that my industry has been aching to know. And I always end the podcast with a final fun question. Since you're not somebody who is in my industry, I have to ask you, what's your favorite piece of branded merch that you own?
That I still own? I'm not sure. All time, 2 things come to mind immediately, and they're both from the same outlet. I ate a lot of McDonald's as a kid, probably too much. And I remember 1992, I was 8 years old that summer, and there was the Dream Team. McDonald's had the Dream Team cups. I think there were 10 of them, and then there were 2 bonus cups that nobody could ever find. I had all of those. And then I think that same year, might have been a year later, but I think that same year, McDonald's also had a Batman Returns mug series, which I just saw on Twitter again a few months ago for the first time in probably 20 years. They were so cool. And I drank out of those every day for probably 2 years, 3 years in elementary school. Other branded content. I'm a big minor league baseball guy. There's so many great items in minor league baseball, especially over the last 20, 30 years since they shifted from different revenue models to more merchandising, thanks to Chuck Domino. He was a big godfather in that. So in terms of different logos, different series of logos, different items, I think it's hard to top the ice cream helmet. And so I've got not a huge collection, but probably minor league baseball ice cream helmets in the basement. My favorite, it's so random because I don't even shop there, but I do have a green one. I don't know where I got this, but it is a green baseball ice cream helmet with the Publix grocery store lettering across the front.
Oh, wow. It was an ice cream helmet?
Yeah, little ice.
Yeah, I used to collect those too. I mean, growing up, I had so many of them. You know, they used to end up on the floor of the car, and I used to like put them in the house. I had like probably 20 of the teams. But yeah, those were really awesome collectibles. You know, it's like environmental too, because you're not wasting plates. You're sitting, you know, you're eating ice cream right out of your helmet, and it's a collectible. So to me, I those are some really cool cool ones. And you mentioned the Dream Team back in '92. I remember that as well. I wonder what those cups are worth nowadays.
Not a lot, because
Oh, they're not.
And unlike some previous eras of printing on cups, those things faded so fast.
Oh, okay.
So fast. McDonald's did do one a few years later. I don't know if this one's worth any money. I had one of these because I had family in Chicago. But when Dennis Rodman went to the Bulls, this was big technology for the mid 90s. They had a Dennis Rodman cup where his hair color would change if there was a liquid in the cup. So if there was ice, if there was a cold liquid, it would change from white to green or whatever. And then you wipe it off back to white with your thumb. Those might be worth a few more bucks. You could probably find those for like $6. You could probably find a full set of Dream Team cups for $20-$30, I bet.
Oh, wow. They must have made so many of them.
Everybody had them. I had probably one or two of every one.
Yeah, they were selling that big time. I still remember that '92 Dream Team. I don't think they lost a game, right?
No.
I mean, they were like, it was like the Globetrotters, watching the Globetrotters go out there and, just have their way with the other team. But again, Matt, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I am on Twitter. I don't tweet a lot about podcasting. I do tweet out some of the episodes, and I probably occasionally tweet out some episodes that I've listened to that I like. But I'm on Twitter, just first name, last name, MattLawell, and then email MLAWELL@GIE.net. Always happy to talk podcasting and lend what little knowledge I have to help folks make a little bit more money in this wild west of a media industry.
Yes, that's exactly what I call it. It's the wild west right now. We're all trying to find our way, those who have podcasts, and it's a little bit goes a long way. But again, Matt LaWell, thank you so much for your time today.
Vinnie, it was a pleasure. Thanks.
See you next time on The Social Angle. Boom. That was great, Matt. That was really good.
Appreciate it.
Let's stop the recording.